thank you for joining us. My name is Trevor Coyle. I'm currently a digital video producer with Reuters. I'm on the RTDNA board as a member, as a webinar producer. Thanks for joining us. A couple of housekeeping notes before we start. There will be a few question prompts as we go. Please respond in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on it, and you can read. I'll read out any questions that you have. There's also an option to respond anonymously if you need to. Following that, there'll be probably about 10 minutes of questions with Craig. And with that being said, we can get right into it. So we're very happy to welcome Craig Lord, a national online journalist with Global News. Craig regularly writes about the housing market, labor force, the stock market, the economy, personal pocketbook issues, and everything in between. So we're very happy to welcome today, Craig. Please take it away, Craig.
Thank you so much, Trevor, and thank you to RTDNA for having me. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about what I do every single day, which is, as I've kind of loosely or kind of casually referred to in this presentation, which is writing financial stories for real people. I'll explain what a real person is a little bit later. I'm assuming most of you fit into that category, though. So thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about it. It's not as simple as it might seem at first glance, but if you're here, I think you know that we are in a pretty interesting era of reporting and of financial times, where we are trying to make sense of a very confusing world in many respects. So our job, I believe, as reporters, both financial and not, is to help people make sense of this world. My goal for this presentation is to give you some of the tools, or at least show you my approach to how I take on that task on a daily basis for Global News. So yeah, please leave comments in the chat. As we go, there will be a couple opportunities for engagement, but I'd love to hear from you. Ask questions as we go. We can always answer them at the end, or if it's relevant, Trevor will let me know, and we'll jump in and answer it there. So let's start talking a little bit about this topic. Starting with me, unfortunately, I should really let you know more about myself. I'm Craig Lord. Hi, my title is National Online Money Journalist at Global News, which means if money is involved, I write about it. I graduated from Carleton University's Bachelor of Journalism program back in 2016. And after that, I've gone to a few different shops. I was at the Globe and Mail briefly doing some video production the summer after I graduated, and have kind of floated with them in the year or so after. But I mainly started my career at the Ottawa Business Journal, actually. And so that is a place here in Ottawa where it's an industry based journal or news magazine. So I was writing about business for business leaders, people who are running their own businesses, or might work at businesses in Ottawa and wondering more about the state of affairs in Ottawa, the capital's business community. And that was my job for a time before I jumped over to Global News. I was the Ottawa reporter, just covering municipal affairs in Ottawa for a couple of years before I got to do this job. I entered into it a little over a year ago, and have been very, very privileged to get to write my stories for a national audience, helping to break down what the big news story of the day is from the financial or business or economic, from all these lenses that we view money and try and understand it. So that's my job. Almost more important, though, is who I am not. I am not any of the things that you see on the screen here. I don't have an MBA. I don't day trade stocks. I'm not an economist. I don't have an economic degree, aside from a couple of classes that I've taken. I am not extremely rich. like most of you, we don't get into this profession for the money. But I think that's important to mention, is that I don't have a very specific background aside from a couple of things I've taken to kind of further my understanding of this field. Of course, here and there, I don't. This isn't my background. I don't have many years of study of this, and that means that you too don't necessarily need many years of study in any of the topics we're going to go over today, because our goal is to write for people like ourselves in many cases. And that's a perfectly fine, if not better, background to come from, because you can be learning these things as your audiences, and your questions will likely be their questions. So the more we can answer those questions for ourselves and others, that's as good a job as we can hope to do in this profession. So I just want to get that out of the way. If you're feeling any imposter syndrome, totally natural, but you too can write financial news. I want to share with you kind of my approach, how I approach financial stories, so that, again, you and your audience aren't overwhelmed by what you're going through. There are very abstract concepts that you're going to have to come across in financial news reporting. I'll give you the basics to cover some of the bigger stories that we've seen in the past year or so, and just kind of an evergreen approach to say, like, okay, if I'm entering into a financial story, how do I get to the core of it and in a way that's accessible for my audience? So I will go through some basic definitions, try not to overwhelm you with those. And then I'll actually go through a recent story that I wrote and rewrote to show you how I arrived at what ended up being its final iteration, but kind of how at each stage of the journey, I reworked it and reframed it to appeal to an audience who might have questions about this stuff. Now, if you wouldn't mind, hop into the chat and give me just an indication of who's here. That'll help me know who I'm speaking to, if we've got mostly students in the audience, or if we've got working journalists, or you know, what your interests are, why you're here. Would love to hear from any or most of you about, you know, what brought you to this presentation, so that I can help to hopefully tailor things to who we've got in the crowd today. So feel free to take a moment in the chat, and then we'll get back to the presentation as quickly as we can.
I can start off and say I'm a desk editor essentially, and I do not have a large background in finance, even though I find myself writing about finance quite often, I would say.
Good. You're the target audience, Trevor. I hope that you know, even if you're not pursuing a career in financial journalism at one point or another, if this is your career, you'll have to write about finance in some shape or form, probably at some point in your career. Whether
it looks like we're having a problem with the chat right now, so we'll try to streamline that. But why don't we continue on? Okay.
Awesome. I look forward to reading your responses later. Let's go over your audience. I mentioned real people off the bat, and that is not to say that company executives and stockbrokers and the top 1% of income earners are not real people. Of course they are. Everyday people is more who we're going for here, because as I mentioned off the top, you know, when I wrote for the Ottawa Business Journal, I wasn't necessarily writing for real people every day. I was writing for people who had already a bit of a foundation of knowledge, and their investments in finance and business are different from what your person sitting at the breakfast table reading the news every morning might want to know about. They might not need definitions for terms like gross profit, or some of the more complex and slightly nuanced terms that we hear a lot in corporate earnings. They might not need explanations of what a dividend is, or a class A share versus a class B share. You don't necessarily need to go over those things, but we are writing for people who, as I've kind of defined here on the right, are, from my view, trying to make the most of the limited money that they have. So these are usually people who are not well off, who are not you would assume set. They are reading financial news because they have questions about their money or they have concerns about their money. They are people who maybe are hoping to make sense of global disruptions. We've seen a lot of stuff even today about banking turmoil in the United States and Europe, and there are many fears in Canada about, what does this mean for us, for our banks, for our money? Things like cryptocurrency. People who were the early adopters of cryptocurrency didn't necessarily need to be reading a necessarily global news article about what cryptocurrency is and what it means for your investments, because that's kind of their niche. That's the stuff that they were already into. We are here for people who are not into cryptocurrency by nature and might have questions about, can this help me make money? Is this going to disrupt the loonies in my pocket, et cetera, et cetera? So that's kind of our audience. And that's not the only audience, not the only one that matters. Like I mentioned, there are many niche publications and even shops like Reuters, where Trevor is, they might not necessarily always break down stuff because they have in many regards, a very financial heavy audience. Executives are often turning to Reuters or Bloomberg for the answers, and Bloomberg probably wouldn't write a story about, the stock market or the latest inflation numbers, same way I would at Global News. So just know that difference as you're going into a story about, who your audience is, and don't worry about writing for the people who already have that base knowledge necessarily. The thing that I'm going to hammer home quite a bit in this presentation is that your audience needs to have stake. You need to give your audience their stake, whatever story it is that you're writing. So they're reading your story because they have a question about the topic that they're interested in, and they think it might affect their money or their prospects or their job. They decide they want to read it there. And when you're writing your story, often you'll have to reiterate or at least get very high up the reason that they should keep reading your story, that you have the answers to something that could change how they handle their money, or prepare them for something that's going to change their money or some aspect of finances that affects their lives. We've heard a lot of talk about, recessions potentially coming in 2023. And when we just hear recession over and over and over and over, it's easy to lose the stake of a recession. Often the stake of a recession is people lose their jobs in a lot more regular fashion. So when we talk about recession, when we talk about the latest economic data, what it means for a possible recession, it's really important to reiterate the stake as much as possible so that people remember, okay, this is why recession matters to me. This is the tangible impact. We want to give people stake. How do we get stake? So I've got a couple examples from recent stories here. Might have heard short sellers were targeting TD Bank. You might not even know what short selling is when you read a headline that, but it probably has the reputation that short selling means that the target of that action might have something negative about them. There might be danger around short selling. So this one, the headline I put on this was simply the question. People who want answers to this question are the ones that I'm targeting with this article. Explained a little bit that, there have been increased short bets against TD stock, tied, to the banking turmoil I talked about later. A second article or a second, statement there, I think, is where the stake really materializes in this story. Customers of TD Bank probably have little cause for concern. That's answering the question that I think a lot of customers of TD Bank would have when they see reports of short selling against the bank. Second bit, some of the people that I talked to for this story said, what, this could actually be really good for people who have investments in TD Bank. So there's a chance that, banks are one of the most commonly invested in stocks in Canada. People reading your story might be investors in TD Bank. And so that, keeps them reading. It satisfies some of their curiosity, but continues to give them stake. I think that's important. This is one from the Globe and Mail. Mark Rendell, an excellent journalist there, writing about the recent strikes. Obviously, major developments in that this morning. But this was something from last week. This I found was a really good job of taking some really abstract stuff about the strike, the need for higher wages against inflation, but the danger that higher wages can actually fuel inflation. I think he did a great job here, kind of putting together that, these employees need to get back their purchasing power they've lost from inflation. On the other side, the government is worried that if they, set a precedent that, yes, you can get more and more wages, that it'll have a big knock-on effect in other bargaining settlements later this year. That was a big, concern, kind of the tone setting that this major, headline strike would set for other wage negotiations. And that might make it more difficult to control inflation. So I think that was a really good juxtaposition of, inflation, this strike itself might not affect you, but if you are bargaining for higher wages right now, here's why it might matter to you. Last one here is a story I wrote recently about open banking. This was a challenge to get stake for because as opposed to, TD Bank or the strike that everyone's talking about, open banking is not a topic that people know about necessarily, and just reading it, you don't know necessarily why you should care. So we tried to address that in the headline there right away. If open banking can mean cheaper services for you and a better credit score, what is it? Those are two things that people know. Okay, saving money on stuff, that's great. Better credit score, that's great. I can maybe get approvals for more loans or a bigger mortgage, something like that. The story itself is actually just about how the Liberal government is late on their deadline for instituting open banking. But if I just said that in the headline, you wouldn't know why you care. You wouldn't know why this missed promise matters. This is so with open banking, and I'm going to get a little bit more into it. Maybe I'll just jump ahead now. The way you explain concepts needs to have that stake or that why in most cases, I would say, before you actually get to a definition. So I call these explainer lines. It can be 1 line or 2 line or however long it takes you to get there. But when you have a foreign concept or an abstract concept like open banking, start with why it matters before you get to what it actually is. After you define why someone should care about it, why open banking will make their lives better or whatever the impact is, then you can define it and then give them an example, make it really tangible to their lives. So here's how I did it in that same story. The why here is that you can connect your financial information to app developers or anyone outside your bank. You know that might not on its own be a big deal to you. You might not know why you care about that. The explanation here is actually a quote from one of my sources. It explains, you can do this safely, securely, and efficiently. That's kind of one of my other big tips I want you to take away from this is that when you have to explain a concept like short selling, like open banking, don't be afraid to ask your sources to do it for you. One of your first articles or one of your first questions, if you're writing an article about this, ask them, hey, I'm writing for a very mainstream audience. They don't have a background in banking. What is open banking? How can I explain it to my audience so that they get why this matters? I find questions like that are really good for setting the tone for your interview so that your source knows, okay, I need to stop using jargon. I need to dumb this down for lack of a better term. Nothing wrong with dumbing down. We want to write as simply as possible. It helps put their answers into a better light and helps you when later it's your job to essentially translate everything they've said into something that your audience cares about. The third line here is that example that makes it real to people. This could be simple budgeting tools that you could build out and connect to a banking app, and it could even help renters qualify for a mortgage. That's something people care a lot about right now because the housing market is very inaccessible to most renters right now, or new Canadians who don't have a credit score built up in Canada as easily. These are things that, again, give stake to what was, before people read this or clicked on that headline, people didn't know necessarily about open banking. Numbers. So Numbers can be intimidating and they can be overwhelming. And I'm here to tell you right now that you should not use a ton of them. It is a death knell for a simple and easy to understand finance story. Obviously, in a lot of financial stories, numbers are necessary, but ask yourself before you put in pretty much any number, does this help tell the story? And then always make sure it's in context. So abstract numbers, that can get very high, say, Loblaws made $3.1 billion in this quarter. That's a huge number that people can't really get their heads around alone. That's why we often say, and that was a 10% increase than last year. You compare it to what the standard is, so okay, is 3.1 billion good for Loblaws? Is it bad? Ways to put context as quickly as possible around the number that you're reporting is going to give it a lot more staying power in the minds of your audience. So I had a poll here. Trevor, let me know if that it's a good idea to ask people to weigh in here, or should I just keep talking about it?
We should. The chat problems, I believe, are solved. So please weigh in.
Awesome. So I'm just asking you here. There is no right answer. I'll tell you that right now. I'll go over kind of the pros and cons after. But tell me, and maybe with a quick explanation or a line or two, which of these lines that essentially say the same thing is more engaging to you? And maybe we'll talk about why a little bit afterwards. And I'm going to take a sip of tea.
So a lot of A's are coming in. Matthew says it's simple in the lines. For A, it's simple in the lines after you go into more detail about how they plan to do that. And I'm sorry if I didn't read that properly. The screen was filling out. Rhonda says A is better. Too many numbers, details in B. And sort of the consensus is A.
Awesome. Out of context, probably agree. I maybe tilted the scales a bit by telling you all to use numbers sparingly right before this poll. Probably should have done that backwards, but what I will say is, I think with A, you get the point across that the federal government has this really ambitious plan to double the pace of home building. You set the stage for, what they're trying to do with building homes, increase the supply of homes. This will go, one would hope, a long way towards affordability, making sure everyone has a place to live that they can afford. B, I think, is right for a story that is more about numbers. What's an example of that? Every month we get housing start data. This is a stat that will tell us how many homes builders broke ground on. Basically, they put shovels in the ground to start building X many homes in the month of March, for example. And so we usually expand that to an annualized rate. So it's like if they kept up this pace through the whole year, how many would they build in it or start building in a year? And if you said they started, the housing starts annualized were 215,000 last month, and one of your lines in this story was the feds want to build 400,000 by 2031 per year. That line might have a lot more power. It might give context in a way that's really necessary. There are other ways to do it. You could still include, I think I did use basically A in a story about the pace of home building and how far behind we are, but it just depends what other kind of context you got in there, what your argument is. If that 400,000 per year line is integral to telling your story, yeah, include it. But for most stories, A probably gets the job done. Yeah. So thank you for playing along with me on the number poll. I'm going to I'm going to show you how I wrote a story about inflation, just the most recent inflation story that we wrote in just a little bit. But first, I have to kind of define a couple terms in order to get us there. So inflation, it's the rate at which prices change. We usually look at this as a year-over-year thing. So if we say 4.3% annual inflation, it means in March of last year, you paid, or sorry, in March of this year, you paid 4.3% more for most things. It's kind of a representative basket that we call a consumer price index. Things generally cost, we call it the cost of living. They cost 4.3% more than last year at the same time. Inflation is always given on a lag, like all economic data. So we're always talking about the past. We can't talk about what's going on right now because it takes time to accumulate the data usually. We talk about subsets of inflation, like food inflation specifically. We can carve that out. Statistics Canada will do that for you in the release, and I'll show you that release in a little bit. But on its own, inflation is very abstract, and it's always best to put it into context with a line like at the bottom. Canadians were paying 15% more for fresh vegetables last month, according to the CPI. So those kinds of lines that really find an aspect of people's lives that they can relate to, buying fresh vegetables at the grocery store, that costing 15% more this year than it did last year. That gets to people. They feel that, not just in their pocketbooks, but reading that, it might draw up some ire, and they want to know more. They want to know why. They want to know when this is going to end. First and foremost, grocery prices are one of the things I write about a lot, because people really want to know when things are going to get back to normal there. That's something that hits their pocketbooks and their lives on a very regular and very real basis. Interest rates, another thing that we hear a lot about. Basically, you can benefit or hurt from interest rates. If you take a little loan from someone like the bank, they will charge you interest typically. So the additional amount on top of what you actually took from them that you have to pay back over time, and that grows the longer you still have the loan outstanding. But if you deposit money at the bank, they pay you interest typically, and that could be higher or lower depending on what kind of account, et cetera, et cetera. But when we talk about like the interest rate in Canada, the Bank of Canada's interest rate, that's something a little bit different. It is the target for the overnight lending rate. These are all synonyms. The benchmark interest rate, the policy rate, the key interest rate. The Bank of Canada's interest rate refers to this figure. It's really a benchmark. It's what all other Canadian lenders look at. RBC, TD, Scotiabank, they all look at the Bank of Canada's key interest rate to determine their own interest rate. So it has this trickle down effect where it really sets the bar for most loans or many kinds of loans in Canada. Last thing I wanted to find is the economy. I could probably take a whole presentation here, but it's basically how much we produce in Canada, the value of everything we produce in Canada. It's how much you're spending, what businesses are doing. Gross domestic product is the main way we track this. If someone says Canada's economy slowed, we're talking about gross domestic product most of the time. Again, always talking about the past, like I mentioned, for all economic data. Went past. How do these all work together? Is probably a question that most people have had over the past year, as we've seen this very rapid rise in interest rates. So interest rates make borrowing more costly when they rise. So the interest you pay on your loan gets more. So you're paying more for a loan. The same loan would cost you more a year from now, a year today than a year ago, because interest rates have risen so much. That makes Canadian debt more expensive. Households have to put more of their money towards paying any debt that they have. So that might be their mortgage, it might be a car loan, it might be credit card debt. Any kind of loan usually becomes more expensive, directly or indirectly. There's different ways that rate that you pay can change, but it makes borrowing more expensive for Canadians and businesses. that means they have less money to spend elsewhere. Typically, everything else staying the same, you have to put more money towards your loans. You've got less money to spend on other things. That impacts inflation because fewer Canadians, hopefully, are buying things. The demand for things goes down, and therefore the price of things tend to go down or stabilize or stop rising as quickly, at least, because supply and demand are the two things that typically set prices. When demand goes down, there's less pressure on prices because fewer people want to buy the same thing. That's the theory. There are many, many ways to dissect that theory, but this is the essential interplay between inflation, interest rates, and the economy. It's why the Bank of Canada wants to slow down the economy by raising interest rates to get inflation under control. I hope I explained that well. Don't be mad at me if I didn't, Tiff Macklem. So why do people care about these things? High inflation means they're paying more. That's an easy one. High interest rates still means they're paying more, weirdly, on debt, but it means that hopefully the economy is going to cool down and inflation is going to cool down, so that in the long term, they're not paying more. That's a tricky balance to strike, but it's really at the heart of a lot of things that we're talking about right now in the economy. And of course, if things slow down too much, people start to lose their job. And that's again back to the stake that we all really have in recessions, in making sure that balance is as close as possible. So with all that said, let's write for a real person. So this was basically the release. So the way my day starts on an inflation release day, usually around mid-month, is I will open up my computer and I will refresh until 8:30, and the inflation data comes out from Statistics Canada for the previous month. And it might read something like this, which it did in in April for March. It said it rose 4.3% year over year, following a 5.2% increase in February. That's great. That means inflation's lower than it was in February when you're comparing the 2 months. It actually says that was the smallest increase since August 2021. That's interesting. That's like 18 months ago, a year and a half. This is the lowest inflation has been. And after inflation rose to 41-year highs over the past year, people want to know that. That's good news for people. Maybe we get to spread some good news today. Mentions that Canadians paid more on mortgages, again, because interest rates are much higher. Their mortgages are more expensive. Makes sense. But a drop in gas prices helped inflation lower anyways. Great. I mentioned people care a lot about grocery stores, so I always jump right to the grocery. What happened to food inflation? Still up almost 10%. That's not great, but it did slow down. People were paying a little bit less for those fruits and veggies. That's great. They highlighted some specific fruits and vegetables that were cheaper. That's great. That's something that you can touch on and highlight to make it real. So if you really like oranges, you had a good month in March, and maybe that'll continue. So something to flag for people who struggle with the grocery store. So anyways, that data's out. I quickly read through it, and I am trying to write as quickly as possible a very short story just to say basically what happened, and I'll write it through later because everyone's coming out with their inflation stories right now, and I want to be among the first if I can. So the headline I went with was highlighting that stat that August 2021. This is the lowest inflation has been. Inflation falls the lowest level in 18 months, and grocery prices ease slightly. I think those are two things people are really going to care about because they care about groceries, and they care about inflation, our inflationary crisis ending. I didn't put the number. Oftentimes you'll see the 4.3 number in the headline. Sometimes that's like, if the number's big and shocking, it's worth it. I didn't think people cared too much about whether it was 4.3 or 4.5 or 5.5. It's going down, and that's what people want to hear about. I did put it in the lead because obviously it is the news of the hit. And I just mentioned, a sharp drop in gas prices. Didn't really have time to analyze it much further than that. Marked the drop, and of course I did talk about what happened at the grocery store. Last line there is just some context to really put all these numbers into context. Inflation's been going down since last summer. Global price pressures have eased. We talked about supply chain concerns. That's what I mean there. And higher borrowing costs weighed on spending. I'm just going to zoom through this because we're a little tight on time and I want to leave some stuff for questions. What I want to highlight here is that mortgage thing that I kind of flagged at the start, and Statistics Canada flagged it too. Lower in the release, it notes that the mortgage interest cost rose at a faster rate in March compared to February, and it was actually the biggest yearly increase on record. So we set a record for how much more expensive mortgages were year over year in March. And I think that's worth highlighting, because as we are trying to make progress on inflation, there are other costs that are rearing their head and really ratcheting up the pain on Canadians, and homeowners particularly will care about that. A lot of our Global News audience are homeowners, or they're trying to become homeowners. So this is something I wanted to highlight. In my second write through, I did flag that, and I said it dropped to the lowest level in 18 months, despite surging mortgage costs. There's kind of some tension there that tells you, okay, overall things are getting better, but what about those mortgage costs? That's kind of the stake that I'm assuming people who are going to click on this headline have going into this story. I spent some time to explain how the Bank of Canada really, really quickly raised interest rates and why that's resulting in so much mortgage pain, and kind of highlight the tension that it was supposed to cool inflation, but actually compounded the pain. Renewing at much higher rates. So just explaining the mortgage thing. And I did eventually highlight here that lower prices for grapes, oranges, celery, and cucumber. This was my final write through at the end of the day. This is my step back, my big picture about, why does this inflation number that we got on a couple Tuesdays ago, why does it matter? Inflation's falling sharply. Great. Doesn't mean we're done with rate hikes necessarily. I mentioned interest rate hikes designed to cool inflation. We've been on pause for rate hikes for a couple of months now. You would think, great, if we're dropping really quickly, it should be done. But there's a question in this headline, like why? Like why are we not done yet? It tied to and actually in this rewrite, I highlighted that, and I actually dropped the actual number to my second sentence in my story, because when people come here, I want them to know the stake immediately. And so I rewrote the start of my story to talk about what their stake is in this. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem basically explained why inflation might not cool quite enough, might not reach that 2% target that they have, and that if it doesn't, even though it's dropping rapidly, if it doesn't hit that 2%, interest rates might still need to go higher. I get more into the complexity of why and why there are still concerns a little bit later in the story, but this is what I tried to get at with that story. This is hopefully the context, the why, the stake that people should have. Just want to very quickly end, because I do want to get to questions if you have any. Why are we writing this story? If there's only one thing you take away from this, it's stake. Give people stake. Tell them why they are invested in this story. Don't worry going into a finance story that, okay, I have to look smart and start off by coming off with a big academic explanation of what inflation did and really put into context, not leave out any critical numbers. That is secondary. Tell people why today's finance story matters to them, and at the end of the day, that's what's going to keep them at your story. Put that technical jargon, all the numbers that you need for the story, or the ones that you need, put them lower down, they'll get to it if they care, but you have to make them care first. You have to tell them why this matters to them. The last thing I have there is just write for someone like you, or for a friend or someone that you care about, that you're invested in. How would you tell someone that, okay, interest rates rose today, you need to know this, this matters for you because, you're a homeowner and you're about to renew your mortgage, you care about this. Imagine that you're just writing for that friend, and what would give you the urgency to tell them a story that you saw in the news today. Write it like that, and hopefully that'll give you that mindset of, okay, where's the stake here? And when you find that stake, hammer it home. That's all I can say. So that was a lot. I was rushing kind of through that example at the end, but I hope I conveyed everything I wanted to. Are there any questions I can answer in the last 5 or 6 minutes we have here?
Well, we've got one already. What does it mean for the cost of food to go up, but for fruit and veggies costing less? What is going on there?
That's a great question. And something worth highlighting. So when we say inflation is dropping, inflation is a rate. We usually say that inflation is cooling or easing. So even if inflation is 1.5%, it still means prices are good. It doesn't mean that prices have dropped 3% from that 4.3%. It doesn't mean prices have dropped. It just means that they are growing at a slower pace. When we talk about food inflation, it might mean that there have been some price drops in some parts of the grocery store, but overall, you might be seeing other areas of the grocery store continue to rise at a pace that kind of surges past where you're seeing relief in other places, right? So grapes, for example, cost 3% less. If you actually see like a 30% discount on grapes last month in aggregate, we're using averages everywhere. Maybe bread was still up 10%. Maybe bread was still costing people $5, a loaf. And so food inflation is a very general, it's an aggregate. It's all the food put together and all the forces, the ups, the downs. Hopefully if inflation is cooling, it means you're seeing more downs than ups. But the cost of living rises. It very rarely will go down. We want to make sure wages keep pace with inflation. That's hopefully how we maintain our lifestyles and our finances. Something the PSAC folks could tell you a lot about in their striking, but I hope that helps to answer that. I wanted you to take away from that question, a reduction in inflation does not necessarily mean prices are going down, just growing at a slower rate, and there might be things that are still growing quickly, even as some are seeing some relief, some price drops, hopefully.
Okay, we've got a next one here. And I think you touched on it a little bit, but maybe if we could do a little quick run through again. What is the reading level of the average person actually paying attention to financial news? How do you balance the needs of general readers and experts in the same article?
Yeah, I don't think necessarily in terms of reading levels. Again, I rely a lot on my own background and my conversations with people in general. If I am explaining a finance story to someone in my newsroom and they get caught up on something, or if it's not something that necessarily they come across every day, err on the side of backing up and doing a quick explainer. It doesn't have to be like I showed in open banking where you're giving 3 lines to give a full explanation. Sometimes it can be so this is an example, net profit. I can say Loblaw's net profit last quarter was Loblaw's net profit, maybe a little M dash, and say the total value of its revenues minus everything it had to spend to make that money was 3.1 billion. Those very quick, like kind of interstitial lines I say, where you just break up your sentence to add in a quick explainer, that's rarely a bad decision. You're rarely going to lose anyone with a very quick explanation, but you can keep someone with it. So that's kind of how I weigh those decisions when I'm writing.
Okay, we've got a few more here. What key questions or question constructions, I guess, sorry, elicit the best or most valuable responses from sources?
Okay, so basically how to ask questions to sources to get them to give you the best stuff. That's hard to answer in the abstract, but like I say, I said at the beginning, remind people, your sources, who your audience is, and don't be afraid to ask a very straightforward question. Why should Canadians care about this? That is a very strong one, for especially more abstract things, like banking concerns in the United States. Why should Canadians be concerned about this? It forces your sources to kind of ground their thinking, and because you're probably talking to an economist or market analyst about this, who's worried about, okay, this is where the stock market's going to go, or this is where interest rates are going to go next. This puts them in the right mindset to answer that question. So those kinds of reminders to say, be open-ended about it, but like, where is the stake? Ask them where the stake is, and they'll help you find it.
I've got this one, and then we'll end on the next one. Do you feel the basic factual coverage of the stubborn increases in food prices, and not just the explanations by company execs, gave people an understanding why this phenomenon was happening?
Food prices are actually really difficult to understand, from the grocer level. It's because they don't necessarily give us, as reporters or analysts, all the numbers that we need to firmly say where price hikes are coming from. So someone like Loblaws or Empire or Metro, they have certain things they have to report. One of the things that they don't necessarily give a lot of clarity on is their margins. So where their profit is coming from on food versus other things. So when people were accusing them of greedflation, of just raising prices and taking advantage of Canadians' willingness to pay extra during a period of high inflation, it was very difficult to say yes or no one way or another. I think we've for the big macro ones, been able to explain that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, global droughts, severe weather have had a major impact. Where I think it's harder, where people have more trouble visualizing it, is stuff like labor impacts. It's very difficult to talk about how there aren't enough people to offload a shipping container in Vancouver, and therefore you're paying 50 cents more for blueberries. That's a hard thread to pull on and really tie for readers. So that's kind of where I'd put the current challenges with making people understand where food inflation comes from.
Okay, let's do this one, and we can wrap up. And it's a pretty good one to wrap up on. If you had to sum up reporting on financial stories with one bit of advice, what would it be?
That's a good one. Writing about financial stories with one bit of advice. Yeah, I would just generally say, don't be afraid to say less and only say what matters. Because with financial stories, it's really tempting to throw in another number and feel like you're doing a better job of proving your argument or a phenomenon. Usually you don't need to, and it's more interesting to get to the next juicy quote or the next example or the next ramification of what you're writing about, than to spend too long making a good point over and over with more numbers or more explanation, more technical jargon. So get in and get out with what people care about. That's I think the essence of it.